What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be doing a security turret. I found this image online from an artist named Ken Fairclough. He did a pretty amazing job with this concept and I thought it'd be really fun to make for this week's model. So without me dragging this on anymore, let's just get started. So like always, I'm going to start blocking out the main shapes. Now I didn't know exactly how I was going to tackle this model, but I decided just to start from the top and work my way down. So I'm just going to take my time as I start figuring out all these proportions. I'm just going off of a few images that this guy created online, so I didn't know exactly how everything worked and how everything was connected. So it was just a little bit of experimenting and playing around with shapes until I got something else happy with. So I'm just going to let the next little bit play out, as all I'm doing is just working on these main top shapes, and I'll start working my way down. So now that those top shapes are all blocked out, I can start moving on to this middle shape. Now this guy is just basically two little cubes on each end, and it has this weird little triangle piece that we're going to tackle later right in the middle, but I'm going to start just blocking these out until I get something I'm happy with. So the shape in the middle has a few triangle cutouts into it, so I'm going to go ahead and add a few edge loops, and then using the multi-cut tool I can start blocking out where exactly I want these triangle cutouts to go. Then once I'm happy with the whole shape, I can go ahead and select those faces and delete them. I'm just going to go ahead and work on the right side of this shape, and then once I'm happy with it, I can cut it in half and then mirror it over, just to make my life a little bit easier. Alright, now moving down to that middle shape that actually holds the gun into place, I'm going to go ahead and select the cylinder we created just to duplicate another. That way I can use a scale tool to make sure that they're lined up correctly, and then I can just combine them into one object, delete all those faces, and then bridge them together. So now here I'm just going to jump back quickly to these middle shapes. I really didn't know how they worked, and I was having a hard time trying to imagine how these shapes fit together because I was having such a large opening around that top cylinder. It just was looking weird to me, so I have to constantly, you'll see me throughout this whole video going back to this middle piece just to play around with these shapes until I got something I was happy with. But this little piece in the middle was definitely causing me some problems, and I just had to spend a little bit more time working on it until I found something that I was happy with. Alright, so now that those two cylinders are combined and bridged together, I can go ahead and start moving some of these verts just to refine the shape. Alright, so this arm shape is slowly coming together, and I can always come back and keep refining it. I just want to keep moving on so I can add some more geometry to it. So on the ends I want to create a couple of extrusions just to give it a little bit more shape. So I'm going to go ahead and select all these faces, delete them, double click the edges, and extrude them inwards. Now I want to create a nice circle with this edge, so I'm going to go ahead with the circularize tool that's directly below that Bifrost tab, and it's going to give me a nice proper circle. So once I fill those holes, I can go ahead and double click this outside edge and give it a nice bevel. Now I'm just going to be focusing on this one side of this arm, that way when I start extracting and separating these shapes, I can just duplicate them over to the other side. It just saves my work and makes my life a little bit easier. Alright, so now I can go ahead and select all these faces right up to where that bevel was, and I can go under the Edit Mesh tab and press Extract. That way it's going to separate these faces from this object, so now I have two pieces of geometry. And the reason for this is I want to create a nice seam between these two pieces, so I can basically extrude these outside edges inwards and give it a very small bevel, and that way it'll look like two pieces of metal that sit really close together. Alright, so it's slowly coming together. I just want to make this shape a little bit more complex looking and a little bit more interesting to the eye. So I'm going to go ahead and select all those spaces where we filled in that hole earlier using that circularize tool. And that way, now that I have a nice proper circle, I can start extruding this shape just to add a little bit more geometry to the sides. And like I mentioned earlier, once I'm happy with the shape on this side, I can go ahead under the Edit tab, go to Duplicate Special, and I can just duplicate it along the X-axis so I can basically mirror it to the other side. And then once I'm done duplicating over this middle shape as well, I can go ahead and add a few edge loops in the middle here, just so I can go select a few of these faces and extrude them inwards. And all I'm doing here is just trying to make this middle object have a little bit more shape so it's a little bit more interesting to look at. Now I can just jump back to those middle shapes that I made earlier, and I can keep refining them just to get a little bit closer to that reference image. Alright, so next up, I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate the same object we just created so I can create the other arm that's directly below it. And then we're going to do the exact same thing we did earlier. I'm just going to reuse the same shapes we just created so I can create the other ones that are below on the sides of the gun. And then starting off with a cylinder, I can start blocking out all the main shapes where the gun's going to be. Alright, so now that those main gun shapes are there, I can start moving on to the turret itself. And those are basically just a combination of a bunch of cylinders and cubes. So I'm going to go ahead and start blocking out those shapes. Alright, and once I'm happy with the shape, I can group all of these objects together, and then I can basically duplicate them 3 more times, so I have a total of 4. Alright, and now keep in mind, I'm not going to be exact with these shapes and positions. I'm trying to model this thing fairly quickly, so when I'm positioning these turret pieces, I know I'm just kind of winging it, and I'm not doing it perfect. So what I should have done is just change the pivot to the center of the cylinder that's directly behind it. That way when I duplicate the object around, it would have been evenly spaced apart. Alright, so continuing on, I'm going to go ahead and block out the remaining shapes. So below this gun, there's like this cage blocked out area that basically catches all the shells, and I'm just going to go ahead with a cube and start blocking out that shape. And once again, I'm just going to focus on this one side, and then I can just easily duplicate this over to the other once I'm done. So this bottom caged area has these cool extrusions on the side. It basically has some like cutouts on the top and then just like a border. So I'm going to go ahead and start adding some edge loops so I can select all these faces and start extruding them in. Alright, now moving on, I'm going to continue working on the back end of the gun. Alright, so the turret is coming together. I just realized the inside area where the turret connects with those top objects, it's just looking a little bit empty, and I feel like I can add a few more objects in there to make it look a little more complex, like there's more things going on. So I'm just going to do that very simply just by adding a cube and then just adding a few edge loops just to add another shape that basically sits right over that arm piece. Now moving on to the back of the gun again, and there's just a few more objects we have left to block out, and that's that big ammo piece that sits on the side. So I'm going to go ahead with a cube and start blocking out these shapes. And keep in mind, I didn't know exactly how all these objects fit together, especially this back area where this ammo drum piece is. I didn't know exactly how it connected, so it was a little bit of experimenting and playing around with the shape until I got something I was happy with. Alright, so the ammo drum is complete and it's time to move on. So I'm going to go ahead and add some thickness to this back object we created. So I'm just going to select all these faces, extrude them, and give it a very small thickness. And while zooming back and looking at the gun, I realized that little opening area on the back where that cube's sitting around, it just looked a little bit plain, and I knew when it came to the texturing, I could always go add some cool shapes that are built into the textures, but I thought I would go ahead, zoom back in, and just extrude out a little area to give it a little bit of a bump. A lot of shapes on this turret are very hard edged, so I thought giving something that was a little bit rounded just would make it a little bit more interesting. So a simple way to do that is just not adding some supporting edge loops on that extrusion I just made. That way when I hit 3 on my keyboard to smooth it out, there won't be anything supporting those edges, so they'll be nice and smooth. Alright, so now moving on, I'm going to go ahead and start beveling out a bunch of these edges. Now, if you were trying to keep this model on the lower poly side, I probably wouldn't do this part, and I would just, you can fake a lot of these hard edges by making them smooth right onto your textures. Now, because this week's model I'm not worried about polys, this is more of a high poly model, I'm just going to have some fun and start beveling out a bunch of these edges just to make it look a little bit more realistic. And I also find beveling edges, if you're not worried about poly count, is a great way to add a lot of realism. When you start adding that light into your scene and the shadows, it just makes those edges look a lot more real when there's a small bevel to them. For this bottom part, I am planning to do like a see-through metal cage texture on this. So rather than adding geometry, I'm just going to go ahead and add a few edge loops. That way when we go into Substance Painter, I can just apply that material directly to that face and just make the texturing process a little bit quicker. Alright, so there's a few other objects we have to block out, and one of those is that little thing, that little object that sits on the back that these cords run into. So I'm just going to go ahead with a cylinder and start blocking out this small shape. Quickly, I'm just going to add 2 more small cylinders on both of these bottom square and this top cylinder. That way I can just add a tiny little cord that connects them both. Alright, so now that that small shape is complete, it's time to move on to the wires themselves. And I'm going to do that with the sweep mesh. So I'm going to go under the Create tab and create an EP curve tool so I can start positioning these points into the line that I was looking for. And once that line's complete, I can basically shrink that nice and small and start positioning these points into the wire, similar to the reference photo I was going off of. And the reference basically showed the wire coming out the middle part, right underneath in the center, and it came out the side, and a piece of duct tape was basically holding these wires to the side of that arm. I thought that was really cool and I wanted to recreate it, so I'm just going to start messing around with these points to get them in the right shape that I was looking for. Once I'm happy with the shape of the line, I can go under the Create tab and turn that into a sweep mesh. And then I just have to go edit some of those settings to get the thickness and the shape of that line that I was looking for. And now since that curve shape's already created from that first piece of wire, I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate that same curve over and then just slightly modify those points to make it just slightly off the original position, and then I can redo another sweep mesh to create the other wire. And I'm going to do the exact same process once again, so I think I have a total of 3 or 4 wires. Alright, so now that those wires are in position, I can move on to the piece of tape that's holding them to the side of the arm. And to do that, I'm going to select a plane, scale that nice and small, bring down the subdivisions, and then start blocking out that shape. Alright, so now quickly I'm going to jump to the top and add a few bevels. Alright, so next up was moving on to those lenses and security cameras that are on the turret. Now there's a total of 3 of them, and they're basically just a bunch of cylinders and squares. So I'm going to start off with one of them on one side, and I can start reusing that same lens to create the other 2. Alright, so now that I have one of the security cameras modeled out, I'm going to start moving on to the other two. And to make my life a little bit easier, I'm going to reuse some of these objects I already created, just to make the process a little bit quicker. Alright, so the second lens or security camera is complete. Now it's time to move on to the final one that's on the top. Now this one's a little bit different. It's basically supported by these metal braces that are attached to those top pieces that are basically mounted to the wall. So I'm going to go ahead with a cube and start blocking out those pieces first, and then I can move on to the lens. Alright, so just one thing I wanted to note, if you are recreating this model, there is one thing that I wish I could redo if I went back and had to redo this whole thing, and that's probably the objects that are underneath the lens. I wish I basically added a few small cylinders, and then when later on in the texturing process, when I'm adding that screen texture, that red texture to this front lens, it'd be cool if I made it a little bit transparent and you could see some objects below or underneath it. So just something to keep in mind if you had a little bit of extra time and you wanted to make it just a little bit more interesting, that's probably something extra I would have done. Alright, so now that the security lenses and cameras are complete, it's just time to add a few small details. So I'm going to jump to the back of the gun so I can add those small little antennas and a few other small objects. I'm also going to quickly select all these edges on this back piece and give them a small bevel. Sometimes I find I can come across some models where I can just continue to work on for hours and hours and you kind of lose track of time and get tunnel vision. And this is definitely one of those models. I definitely lost track of time and I really wanted to keep going. And I realized how long I've already been spending and I knew I had to wrap it up pretty soon. So there's just a few other things that were bothering me I just wanted to touch up really quickly. So we're going to quickly just jump to those and wrap those up. Alright, so the turret is almost complete. There's just a few small details I want to finish up, and especially those cords, the little ones that are behind those security cameras. So let's just quickly go wrap those up. And I'm going to do that the exact same way we did before with the sweep mesh. So I'm just going to copy over the exact same curve I already created, and I can just remove some certain points if I need to and reposition them. But just to make my life easier, I'm just going to reuse them. So all the cords are now wrapped up. I'm just going to move on to bevel out a few more of these hard edges. Alright, so when I was adding all these extra little components and details, I realized that the arm was looking a little bit plain, and I knew when it came to the texturing I was going to do some bolts directly on the textures and add a few details that way, but I knew that the reference I was following had a really big indented bolt here, and I wanted to basically recreate that one small detail. So I'm going to go add an extra edge loop around this object, just to create a few more polys so I can go boolean a small low poly cylinder. That way when I go in with my target weld tool, I can just connect all these verts to those extra edge loops that I just added. And then it's just a matter of going in after that boolean's created, just beveling out those edges, and then when I press 3 on my keyboard to smooth it, I get a nice indented circle into this piece of arm geometry. So while looking at my reference, there's this half cylinder that sits below this gun turret, and I start modeling that and I quickly stop to realize it just doesn't really serve a purpose and it doesn't look that interesting in the model, and rather than just dragging this out to create a little piece that's probably going to be a lot of work for something that's not going to drastically improve the model, I just end up cutting it out. So I just quickly start blocking it out here, but I just remove it a few minutes later. But one of the details on the reference I did notice that I did want to add was on the side arm of this turret gun. So basically the cylinder here had a square, a little extrusion that came up and attached to the object that was directly above it. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. It just makes the object look a little bit more complex, and I thought it would just be a good piece to add. Alright, so we're almost done the turret model. We just have a few small details to do, and one of those details are the large bolts that sit on the top. Now I wanted to do a lot of the screws and bolts directly into the textures, but for the larger ones I just wanted to create them with geometry. So I'm going to go ahead with a cylinder and start blocking out that shape. Alright, so now for this inside of this bolt, for the outside rivets here, you probably don't need to add this into geometry. To be honest, you probably won't be able to even pick this up in the final renders, but since it's a higher poly model and I'm just having fun here, I decided just to extrude a few small rivets on the side of this bolt. Alright, so now that that bolt is complete, I can just scale that nice and small and then go position it on the top of my model. Alright, so now that those bolts on the top are in place, I'm going to start adding a few more bolts to the center arm of my model. Alright, so fast forwarding a tiny bit, I just added a few small bolts to that top arm that I just mentioned I was going to do. And then while looking at my reference, I actually realized I missed a pretty important piece. And in my turret, on those the actual barrels themselves, there's a small inner barrel that sits right in the middle of them. So I'm going to go ahead, create another cylinder, and I can start blocking out that shape. Alright, so the barrel is complete, and like I mentioned, we're going to go ahead and delete this plane that I created earlier, and the last final touch, I'm just going to create some small squares to fit on the sides here. And I promise, this is the last thing. Now all left to do is all the UVs, so I'm going to go ahead and fast forward the video so I can show you exactly how I did those. Alright, so here I am fast forwarded a little bit, and I already completed all of those UVs, and I just did a little bit of extra work. I basically added all of those bolts we already created. I just duplicated them and spread them all over the model. So on the bottom here, just along the edges, and all on the top of the arms, I just basically duplicated the exact same bolts over and over again. And then I went in also and just beveled a few of the hard edges, the ones that we missed, added a few small wires you can see here on the cameras. Other than that, everything's the exact same. I just basically beveled and duplicated bolts. So taking a quick look around the model, I'm going to show you exactly how I grouped everything and how I did those UVs. So there's 4 different maps, and I grouped them into 4 different groups. One was the gun, the other being the top piece, all the middle arms, and then all the cameras themselves. Now I could have obviously merged some of these smaller, so I could have combined the lenses into the arms or something, but I thought why not keep it like this. So here are all the UVs showing exactly how I did those. Now, I was a little bit sloppy here, I'm not gonna lie. These curved UVs, I could have straightened these. I was just really rushed. Like I said, the model took a lot longer and I'm honestly running out of time, so I just had to do it relatively quick. But I could have definitely done this a little bit better if I took a little bit more time. Now, I decided just to do 4 texture maps, but you could cut it down to less or add more if you want, depending on what your model is going to be used for, so keep that in mind. But I'm happy with it, so let's jump into Substance so we can start texturing. Alright, so now jumping over to Substance, I can go load in my FBX from Maya. Alright, so once that FBX is loaded into Maya, I'm just going to take a quick look around to see how things are looking. I always like to go quickly through those UV maps just to make sure that there's nothing obviously standing out like overlapping or anything. But things are looking pretty good, so I can go down to my texture set settings, scroll down to bake mesh maps, and I can choose my output size. I chose 4K, but whatever you like, make sure to check that use low poly mesh as high poly mesh, and then you can bake out your textures. Alright, so I'm going to start texturing this turret just like we did the modeling. I'm going to start from the top and work my way down. So I'm going to go ahead and select that top texture map, and I can go start looking through these smart materials to choose what my base material is going to be. Now, Substance already has a pre-built texture in there that's called Steel Gun Painted, and I thought how fitting and how perfect would this texture be because I'm making a gun, so I decided to go with this one and just open up that folder and start tweaking some of those settings. So all I'm going to do is just right click it, set it to a black mask, and then using the projection tool I can go select all my meshes I want to apply this texture to. So I'm not going to stress too much about getting the perfect color off the start. I always find for my workflow when I start adding other materials to other meshes, it starts helping me figure out exactly what shades and tones these colors should be. So I'm not going to stress about getting everything perfect off the start. I can always come back and modify and just adjust these settings later on. And actually, one of the colors I was having a really difficult time with throughout the whole texturing process was that green metal texture. For some reason, I kept having the halo character in my mind every time I was looking at it, so I ended up just making it a little bit more blue or a little bit more gray, but you'll see me constantly jumping back to tweak this setting just because for some reason that metal color was just really bothering me. Alright, so all these top meshes have materials applied to them, so I'm going to work my way down, and next up is jumping to that arms texture. So to keep the metal material consistent throughout the whole model, I'm just going to go ahead and copy that same steel gun painted texture we applied to those top meshes, just so I can copy them over to the bottom ones. And once again, tweaking the color. And once I find a color I'm happy with, I can just go ahead and copy that color code and then jump back to my previous material, and I can apply that same code to that texture so it has the exact same color. So now that I have all those textures copied over, I just have the wires and the duct tape to do. So I'm going to go ahead and select a rubber tire texture so I can apply it to those wires. Now for this duct tape material, I downloaded this off of the Substance source website, so you can jump on there and download it if you want to add it to your Substance library. But it's a really good duct tape material and it looks very realistic, so that's exactly what I applied to this piece of mesh here. I just changed the rotation and bring down some of those wrinkles just to not make it look so dramatic. Alright, so the arms texture has all of those materials applied to the meshes, so next up on the list is the lens texture. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that same steel texture over so we can apply it to those meshes as well. For all of the lenses themselves, I'm going to use a glass film material. It's a smart material that already comes preset in Substance Painter, and that way I can just go change the reflectivity and change the colors just to get something really reflective. Now, like I mentioned earlier in the modeling process, I could have actually added some geometry behind these lenses, and that way I could add a little bit of transparency to the material, so you'd be picking up those objects behind the lenses, and it would just make the objects look a little bit more realistic and a little bit cooler in my opinion. But it is what it is. We didn't have enough time, so we're just gonna keep these opaque so we can't see through them, and just change those colors to get a really cool red for the top one and a darker blue gray for the bottom. Alright, so the plan was to get a small little green glowing light from that bottom lens. Now to get that glowing effect, I need to add an emissive channel to that material. So to do that, I need to go up to my top right corner in my shader settings and change that to alpha blending. That way when I go back to that material, it'll give me an emissive channel that I can actually apply to it, just so I can get that green glow to actually show. So like I just mentioned earlier, to actually get that glowing effect to show, I need to add an emissive channel to this material. So I'm going to go over to my texture set settings, scroll down to that little plus icon, and then I can go choose the emissive channel to add to it. That way all I have to do is just drag up that emissive slider and change the color depending on how bright I want it to glow and whatever color I want it to show as well. Alright, so now that the lens's texture is complete, it's time to move on to the last one we have, which is the gun texture. So I'm going to do the exact same process, copying over the same steel gun painted texture, just so I can apply it to those other meshes. Alright, so once that steel gun painted texture was applied to all those metal meshes, it's time to move on to the barrels. So I experimented with a few here, but I ended up going with the steel dark stained one, and then just jumping into the folder to tweak some of those settings. Alright, so next up was moving on to that metal mesh material that sits below the gun that catches all those shells. So first off is adding a base material. So I decided to go to my smart materials and I chose a silver armor texture to apply to that mesh. Then once that's applied, next up is just adding those see-through holes. So to do that, I chose that metal perforated material. Now I found this on the Substance Source website, so you can do the exact same if you want to use the same material. But all I have to do is click that and drag that into that exact same folder, the silver armor that I applied to that same mesh, and just drag that below the base color. Now, obviously nothing's going to show and you're not going to see any transparency, you're not going to see any transparent holes, and that's just because we haven't added an opacity channel to it. So the exact same process we did when we added that emissive channel to that bright green glowing light, except for just instead of choosing the emissive channel, we're just going to choose the opacity channel. So once I actually go to my texture set settings and I add that opacity channel, you'll suddenly see those holes appear in that material and we can see through it. So then it's just a matter of going in and scaling that material down, just depending on how big I want those holes to be, and then just playing around with a few of those settings. So I wasn't really happy with how those barrels were looking, so I just quickly tried a different smart material, one of those dark steel aged, and I liked it much better, so I ended up just tweaking a few of these settings and ended up going with this one. Alright, so now that all of those materials are applied to all of my different texture maps, it's time to add a few small details. So I'm going to go choose a few alphas that come preset in Substance Painter, and just so I can add a few decals on my model. So all I'm going to do is select a plastic matte material, and then change that to a black mask, and then go find an alpha that I like, and I can paste that directly onto my mesh. Then it's just a matter of changing the color and changing a few of those settings so it fits a little bit better with the model. So for the next little bit, I'm just going to go apply a few small decals on the model, and then I'm going to go start tweaking a few of these materials that are already applied and change a few of these colors just to get something a little bit closer to what I had in mind. Alright, so now quickly jumping over to the renderer to see how things are looking, and I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out. There's obviously a few things I wish I did differently, or it's just one of those models that I could have easily spent a few more hours just adding more details and bring it to life a little bit more, but I already spent way longer than I usually do on these weekly models, so it is what it is. I'm still really happy with how it turned out. But thank you for tuning into this week's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more weekly 3D content. Other than that, I will see you guys in the next one.